So last week we started the sugya of Tatogavar and Logavar, and the fundamental question we asked is, isn't 1,000 years enough to decide whether Ilogavar or Tatogavar? I mean, how long will it take to determine Ilogavar or Tatogavar? And actually, I presented three mahalchim, fundamental mahalchim. The Noida says there are always exceptions, and it is not ironclad that a chaticha will always give tam. And that is why a chaticha should nafal l'toich kedera, and it was cooked, boiled. And then it's nafal l'toich another kedera, asas kedera number 2, not only kedera number 1. Chavas das, Simen Kuf Hey, and to the best of my memory, I think it's Sivkot and Ted Zayin. The Chavas das asked the same question, but even in a more extreme case. A chaticha nafla lechamishim. And a kfeile tasted the dish and he determined, yesh bo tam isar. We take that chaticha out, pot number 2, we cook it again. Does it answer the second pot? Of course it does. But if a kfeile testified there is no tam in the first pot, why does it answer pot number 2? So I think I mentioned this Chavas Das. Did I next week? Did I mention the Chavas Das? And the Chavas Das says that a chaticha can't affect more than shishim bevasachas, but it could bezacher zeh. The Imre Boruch, the Boruch Tam, and that's in Kuf Hey, Hilchos Ta'aruvos Yivkot Design. The Boruch Tam says it doesn't make sense. So if it could answer one pot and then another pot, why don't we need to be choishish that it gave twice tam in the same pot? What's the logic that it would be different between 2 pots and the same pot if it's cooked for an hour? Cooked 5 minutes, you're choishish for nesinas tam. So if it's cooked for an hour, maybe it was poilet once, and then it's poilet again. So why would there be a difference, 1 pot to 2 pots? That's what the Baruch Tam asks. But he doesn't come up with a reasonable answer in the kasha of the Chavas Das. So fundamentally, Tatogavar Logavar, the Noida says, might be an exception. And I asked, so check it 100 times. Check it 500 times. Approach number 2 is the placing. Tam Kolush. And I say, Tam Kolush is reasonable by Gida Nosha. But it's not reasonable when there is a machloikis menakot zelakot elogavar or tatogavar. One says elogavar and the other says tatogavar. Approach number 3 is the Aruch Shulchan. Helchasa. When there's a Mesoros Chazal, nothing could change that. But the question is still nagging. But the Mesoros Chazal is based on a Mitzias, Nois and Tam, or not. So let me give you my fundamental approach, which I started talking about last week, but I didn't really formulate it properly. And I want to touch 2 other sugyas. Kfeila. Chulin tzadik ches. Chetiches is enough for a tocheta ben esbashal. We ask a chef to taste. Why do we need a kfeila? That's a big machlokes rishonim, as the B'si Yosef brings in Siman Tzadik Ches. Are they because only a chef could really define a taste, and we don't rely on a layman? Or we only believe a kfeila because he doesn't want to hurt his reputation? Uman lo mara no say. So there are 2 different approaches. The nafkemina would be, would we rely on a kohen to taste a dish in which is bashal truma? So the kohen is not a chef, but he's not a guy. He's a kohen. So if the reason we need a kfeila is because only a professional could determine whether there's a taste or not, we can't rely on just any kohen. But if the reason is a guy doesn't have an amonis, unless he is a uman, then we could trust any kohen. There's a machlokes in Rishonim which the B'si Yosef brings. Do we rely on a kfeila even pochas mesamach? And a kfeila says there is no tam. Or do we rely on a kvela only yoyse mesamach? But poches mesamach we always asa. Two different opinions.
So then how could the Ramah say we always fast in Shisha?
So originally, we always need a kvela. Poches mesamach, a kvela wouldn't help. Yoyse mesamach, you need a kvela. That's one opinion of the Rishonim. Shulchan Aruch paskins, no. Yoyse mesamach, you don't need a kvela, and the only time you need a kvela is dafka poches mesamach, and that is the psak halach. So this is a bit confusing, and what I want to argue is a kvela is not really a hachroa brura. Scientifically, it is known no people actually taste exactly in the same way. Taste is individual. Some people like spicy food. Ashkenazim can't eat spicy food. And two people will eat the same mortar. One will cough his head off, and the other is like a walk in the park. Most people would differentiate between salt and sugar, sweet and bitter, and spicy or not. But taste is very individual. Like smell is individual. Like sight is individual. Some people are colorblind. Some people confuse certain colors. So when we rely on kfeila, it is somewhat arbitrary. Especially, tam is not always easy to define. Tam l'shvach and tam l'ginai. How could we rely on a person that says, is it an appealing taste or not an appealing taste? What appeals to one doesn't really appeal to another. So kfeila is somewhat a problematic halacha. But that is the halacha. Assumption number one. Assumption number two. When there is no kfeila, and according to the Ramah, first Sif and Siman Tzadik Ches, Bismanenu, we don't rely on a kfeila. It's not relevant. Shulchan Aruch says yes. And if you have a kfeila, you don't need shishim, according to the Shulchan Aruch, Tzadik Ches Sif Aleph. The Ramah says we don't rely on a kfeila. And there's somewhat confusion why don't we rely on a kfeila, but not all the Achronim saw the Ramah in Toras Chatos. And the Toras Chatos says, in our days we no longer rely on the judgment of a kfeila. And in a future shiur, I will share with you an interesting observation. In about 10 seifim in Shulchan Aruch, the Machlokes Shulchan Aruch and Ramah, do we rely on bedikas? So the tradition of the Ramah is we don't rely on mumchim. Generally speaking, we don't rely on mumchim. And the B'Seisef says, why not? Why do we assume things change from the days of Chazal to our days? But the Toras Chatos explains, we don't rely on a kfeila because, not because we don't believe him, because we no longer rely on the ability to differentiate between one taste and the other. So when there is no kfeila, min b'shein or minoi, how much do we need to be mevatel? Chulin Tzadik Ches, very conflicting opinions. One says 30, one says 43, one says 45, one says shishim, one says mea. So the span is from 30 to 100. Shishim or mea, shneim lo ilamdu ela mizroya b'sheila. So in the Chatos is a din of zroya b'sheila. The zroya is also b'achila. Why doesn't the zroya asa the entire animal? So it's a machlokes in the Gemara whether the zroya is one of shishim or one of mea. And what does it depend? Do we take into account the bones or only the meat? But the Gemara says, shishim or mea, we learn from zroya b'sheila. Is that exeris hakosov? It's not exeris hakosov. The fundamental question is, Bekama yesh koyach be'isr litin tam be'eter. tavlin afilu be'elef lo yibot. So every sensible person knows that you cannot give the same rule for all different type of foodstuffs. L'cha'ira bosa shomein, a good piece of steak. Bosa shmeina. Why are you laughing?
It's the Rav story with his wife that he told us.
Oh, so my story. Yeah, I didn't remember I told you that story. Sometime after I got married, I was sitting and learning, and my wife sat down next to me, my late wife, and she said, "Could you share with me? Let's learn together a bit." So we learned this of it, and Bosa Shmeina, she starts laughing. And I asked her, "What's so funny? What's so amusing?" She asked, "What's Bosa Shmeina?" Bosa is Lashon Zocher, Shmeina is Lashon HaKaiva. What's Bosa Shmeina? Why is it Bosa Shmeina? Never thought of it. So we would say Bosa of a Behemish Shmeina, which doesn't really make much sense. So that's why you were smiling. So every sensible person would assume that a real saucy piece of steak would give more time than a carrot or a cucumber. But Chazal didn't differentiate. Shishim is shishim. So the point I want to make is a fundamental point. And this brings me to a Yesod Godel, which to me is so fundamental in the length and breadth of Torah Shabbal Peh. And sometimes I wonder, why did such Yesodis wait for me and nobody before me? No, really, I say this humbly. This is such a choshev Yesod. Nimsar adover lachachomim. And then Minchas Chumash Devarim, I don't remember which sermon, there's an Arichas Gedolah. Some areas the Torah left for Chacham. Kasha Nimsar adover lachachomim. And this concept, Nimsar adover lachachomim, is only found twice in Shas. Chagigid Daf Yudches and Pchoros Chofei. Chagigid Daf Yudches regarding Meleches Chalamoid. Pchoros Chofei is a very local sugya, small one, but a fundamental one. When a Bchor is Noilad Eitzel Yisrael, and the Bchor belongs to Shevet Kohuna, how long does the Yisrael need to take care of that little animal before he gives it over to the Kohen? If he'll give it to the Kohen immediately, that little animal will perish in a day. Because Kohanim had no land, so they had no herds of animals. Kohanim had no possessions. They lived off matnas kohuna. Chelik lo yeh lehem ba'oretz. They were expected to dedicate their days and nights and all their livelihoods to avoid this amigdosh. So he doesn't have a herd. Who will suckle, who will feed, who will nurse this little baby animal? So the Mishnah says, if it's a behemoth daka 30 days, if it's a behemoth gasa 50 days. Why 30, why 50? So the Gemara says, Nimsad davar chachamim. So when the Torah gives us a fundamental rule, a klal, and the klal needs to have protim. Ein bechlal ela masha beprat. Without the details, there is no meaning to the klal, to the general rule. But the Torah doesn't give us the details. Nimsa davar chacham ubechi hay gavne divrei chachomim ke divrei Torah legamre. Kol Torah kula nimsa lachachomim lefaresh. But in certain cases, the chachomim are not only commentators; they are legislators. Do you know the difference? In certain areas, the chachomim are mechokekim and not parashanim. And in those areas, divrei chachomim ke divrei Torah, and they have the authority of noisen haTorah, and what they say is men haTorah. And I wrote 3 columns how to identify those sugyas. When do we say nimsar adov al chachomim v'divrei chachomim ke divrei Torah heim? I strongly suggest taking some time to learn that summon because it is so fundamental and so important. And I think the entire realm of Tam Isor is one of the areas Shenimsa Adova Lachachamim. And that is because, on one hand, tam ke'ikar. And tam ke'ikar is a din diuraisa. And tam isar is ke'isar mamish. And that's a din diuraisa, tam ke'ikar. On the other hand, it is virtually impossible to determine with confidence and in a definite way when there is tam, when there is not tam. As the Noidibud explains, it's not always the same. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. The Ran and Churen Tzadik Ches says sometimes a machal could be noisen tam be'yosem mishishim. If tavlin is noisen tam be'elef, sometimes it would be yosem mishishim. Avla chachomim lo choshishu, because usually it's only ad shishim. So the chachomim, the koyach shenimsar biyodam, and the authority that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave them, it is up to them to be korvei akrolim, iprotim, umasmeris, nituim. And Chachamim are fully aware this is not an absolute science, but this is the way we see it. And we exercise the koyach, the authority shenimsa biyadenu that HaKadosh Baruch Hu entrusted us with, and these are the rules. And Chachamim understood it's impossible to be kaveya whether this piece of steak or that piece of steak, and would there be a difference between chicken and turkey on the top or the bottom, between a carrot and a tomato. It's impossible. So Chachamim said, these are the guidelines, these are the rules. We did our best. We rely on a kfeila. The Ramos says, no longer. But Chachamim were aware that a kfeila is not 100%. People taste things in different ways. And how do we rely on a kfeila whether it's noisen tam l'shvach and noisen tam l'avgam? So most of the times it'll work. Not all the times. So the entire realm of bitul, b'mimish einoi minoi, of kfeila, is totally, it was never meant to be a scientific proof. It is extremely arbitrary. But there's no other way about it. Because on one hand, tam keikar. On the other hand, it was clear for Chachamim that we're not going to answer everything in the world. There is a din of bitul. So Chachamim bekoyach shenim sebiyodam were kavei mesmeres that most of the time will work. Being fully aware, not all the time. But if those are divrei Chachamim, and kishenim said divrei Chachamim ki divrei Torah, so if a person eats a machal that is bottled b'shishim, even a kamei shmaya galia, that there was a tam isur, he has no aveda whatsoever. Because divrei Chachamim ki divrei Torah. And the area of tam isur, just like many other areas in Torah, bechreach nimsa biyad Chachamim. And this brings us back home to a lo agova or to agova. So in my understanding, sometimes a lo agova, sometimes to agova. And to me this makes so much sense. Because all the explanations in the Rishonim, the top is squeezes on the bottom, and the bottom is this, and the Aruch HaShulchan rightfully argues, wouldn't it make a difference? What's bigger? But I proved last week it doesn't make a difference what's bigger. Pesach shesocher b'shemen shel trumo. Eno choraya gedoyle mezu. But the Aruch HaShulchan appeals to your senses. If we have a little piece of cheese and you have a big chunk of steak and you put it on the cheese, we say tato agava, and the steak will be cooled off by the slice of cheese, and not the other way around. So the machlokes is sometimes lo agava, sometimes sedo agava, but the machlokes is most of the times, and this is something which is really impossible to determine, because we're going to check 100 times, but we can't check 100 times how big this was and how big that was. And if we would check 100 times, probably the result would be 55 times the lo agava and 45 times the tu agava. And the next time we check 100 times, it might be 48 times Eloah Gover and 52 times the Torah Gover. So if we understand that this is not a really scientific determination, it is confusing. It's impossible clearly to determine. And that's the Machlekes Rav and Shmuel. What is the general rule? And understanding. Takonas Chazal. And in this area, Takonas Chazal is not midirabanan. It's Menat Torah. Because Nimsa Hadava B'Yodam. And this will make it so more appealing to understand so many sveikas in Hilchos Issa V'Heta, which are very confusing. In the din of Kfeila, in the fundamental din of Bittul B'Shishim, and especially in the Sugi of the Torah Gover and Eloah Gover. And the Yesod Dvorim is, it is really impossible clearly to determine whether there is a Tam or not. Sometimes there will be no Tam in Pochas Meshishim, sometimes there will be Tam in Yosef Meshishim. And therefore, La'achar Shechachomim Kovu Ma Shekavu. So if a Cheticha Sesor was cooked Keneged Chamishim, and a Kfeila says there is a Tam, it's still what Asa Pat number 2. Because Chachomim didn't differentiate between, did we determine in Pat number 1, is there a Tam or not? And these are Halachas Kevuos, Shetiknu Chachomim. So this is my mahalach in the entire broad concept of Mimshen Aminoi, of Bitul Betam, and also the way to understand, and this is approach number 4, to answer the question, so why can't we finally decide whether Eluah Tova or Torah Gover? Because it's really impossible to decide. Because it depends on many factors. Sometimes it'll be Eluah, sometimes Torah. What type of foodstuff? Quantity. But Chazal didn't find a formula. How much quantity? And what kind of foodstuffs? And so my understanding is many times the top will be more dominant. Sometimes the bottom will be more dominant. And the question, fundamental question is, most of the times. And that's the Machlekes Rav and Shmuel. And just like Kfeila, we're never confident that what the Kfeila says is really definitive. But most of the times, it would be. And Bittul B'Shishim is not all the times, like the Ran already says, but most of the times. Sometimes a Machalisa doesn't even have enough to give Tam in 40. Sometimes it has so much roitiv it'll give Tam in 100. And Chazal felt a need, a necessity to be koveya halachos kvuos, gedorim kvuim. And therefore, all the halachas of Bittul B'Shishim are based on umdana, al pi rav, and the koyach shenimsa b'yad Chazal, and hecha shenimsa b'yad Chachomim, divrei Chachomim k'divrei Torah. So what you still need to appreciate is this segment. When do we say divrei Chachomim k'divrei Torah? There must be a fundamental rule. Because in the vast majority of Sugas Shas, divrei Torah, divrei Chachomim, divrei Chachomim. It is only a very limited number of Sugas in which we say Nimsa Dava B'Yodam. But that is a separate share which we will need to discuss at another time. But do we have a Mechas Rosh Torah here, the new edition?
Not yet.
What?
Not yet.
Why not? Haven't I been here long enough? Please give me a list of this form. So in Mechas Rosh Devorim, I don't recall which simon, there's a lengthy discussion of the concept of Nimsa Davar Chomim, which is very important B'chlal for B'nai Torah to learn, and also regarding the sugya we discussed today.
Why by Tavlin or the Mechalek?
By Tavlin?
Yeah.
Because Tavlinim are always made specifically, even though there are very small in quantity, but they are very potent in time. And that is what is unique about Tavlina.
And مخالف that from every other type of food.
What?
And then مخالف that from every other type of food.
Yes, that is unique to spices, because that is the nature of spice. Spices are very small in quantity, and they very potent in the time. But Chachamim did not want to differentiate between foodstuffs, because that will be impossible, because they will need to write a 1,000-page catalog. And how would they know? How would they know? It's impossible, And therefore, and that is why I say, in this area, because there's no other way to deal with it. And if you follow what they say, you are always safe. And that is because of this unique formula of Nimsa Adov al-Chachamim. V'divrei Chachamim, divrei Torah. I use the expression as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu told the Chachamim, Ani v'atem netayel began Eden. You remember that phrase? Yeah.
Duv the Melech.
Yeah. As if HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Chachamim, Ani v'atem niten Torah liYisrael. I, together with you, will give Torah. And I leave space for you. I gave the clown, you fill in the protein. I gave the general rule, it's up for you to give the details. And it's a shutvis. And in these areas, Chachamim are not only parashonim, not only commentators, they are mechokikim, legislators. V'divreim k'divrei Torah. And that's the way I understand. So, I had fragments of these thoughts in my mind, but it is only now that I really brought out the proper nisuach, the proper formula.
Why don't we rely on kfila nowadays? Why does Ramah not rely on kfila?
So the Ramah, as I said before, and maybe we will dedicate a shir to this, has this general mistrust of mumchim today. And we find that in Hilchos Nida, we find that in Isaveta, we find that in Hilchos Shrita, we find that. I will bring together all the sources in which we
Kfila's got
find.
nothing to do with mumchim.
What?
If kfila's got nothing to do with mumchim, but to do with the gezerah of Chazal, then who cares that?
Everybody agrees that a kfela should determine is there a taste or not. The question is, do we rely on the layman or only on a mumche? And the Ramah feels benkach u benkach, bi'eridas adoris, we no longer have this ability and this kishorin to determine a taste.
If it would come out that even our Piroi, Chazal wrong, doesn't matter anymore? Because the
Does
matter
it-
they had it was Nimsa.
Yes, it does not matter. Does not matter. That's why I say,
Even
Yosem Mishishim, even if Kamish Maya Galia, that there is a tam, mutar lechatchila.
if we did the perfect experiment now, it still wouldn't matter.
Yes.
What about a vast majority? 98%.
So maybe the next year will be a very disturbing discussion that developed in recent years. So we live in an age of discovery and innovation in every area, and in science as well. So engineers, who their specialty is mahandasei chomarim, I don't know how to define that in English, have checked steel pots, and they argue there is no blia. In our modern pots, there is no blia. So would we rip out 120 pages from Shulchan Aruch HaRachaim and major segments of Hilchos Ta'aruvos and Basar V'Cholev and say they are no longer relevant because science has determined that our kelim are not burleya? So this question depends on two fundamentals. To what degree do we rely on scientific analysis and decision? Question number two: if indeed there is no blia, would we still say that we need to adhere to the halachas of Issa v'Heter? Some
Zecher?
what?
Like a Zecher?
Nipsa.
If we say zecher, that'll be a very flimsy argument. Maybe shemi yachzer adav lekol kulei.
We'll
That'd
stop
be
using
fine.
that alloy and we'll go back to the.
What?
We'll stop using the alloy and we'll go back to the original material.
So this is a very interesting discussion in science as well. So some of the Bonim came out with an argument. Our metals are more condensed than they ever were, and they're stronger, and therefore they're not Beleya. In the past they were. It is clear that our metals are far more durable than they were in the past. I heard from my parents that it was very common in days of yore that you had patches on pots and pans. And a pot after many years developed a hole and you welded on a patch. And that was a profession. And my mom remembers pots that had patches in her home growing up. I do not recall, in the last decades that any pot in my home just got a hole. Well, sometimes the handle would break off, but I don't remember a pot developing a hole. But on the other hand, scientists say that the molecules in metal are smaller than fat molecules. It does not depend how durable the pot is. And if we determine today that steel isn't Beleya, the same would have been 100 or 200 or 300 years ago.
They didn't have steel.
So some people actually tried to boil coffee. And why coffee? Because coffee has a very powerful aroma and taste. So they boiled 10 cups of coffee bezeh achar zeh in a metal kli. And then after boiling 10 cups of coffee, they boiled, after cleaning the pot, a clear water, and the water was as clear as it originally was. There was no zecher of coloring of coffee, nor of the taste. They did the same with the klei cheres, and the result was starkly different. And it was proven that klei cheres is Beleya. Klei matris, obviously not, at least not to the degree of klei cheres, which is a troubling question. So as I said, would we rip out, most of the dinam of blias and hechsher kelim are in Hilchos Pesach. Some of them are in Yoredeya. Yoredeya we deal more with Issa v'Heter of the foodstuffs. But Hagola, hechsher kelim, is more in Hilchos Pesach. Are those halachas still relevant? So I wrote a lengthy tshuva about this, which I'll share with you at the next year.